My name is Samantha. I'm the Manager of Prevention and Public Education for Women's Place of South Niagara. We are a nonprofit agency that supports women and children who are experiencing abuse. Our mission and vision for the agency. So our mission is right here: to stop abuse and violence against women by providing safe shelter, counseling, education, advocacy, and community partnerships. And our vision is a community where women and their children live free from abuse and violence. So what we do is we empower women by providing them with options and supporting them in their decisions. No clients are ever told what to do. So just some housekeeping before we dive in. Firstly, it's really important to note that during the presentation, I will typically use gender-specific language because we'll be talking about gender-based stereotypes and some gender-based violence, but that is not to exclude any non-binary individuals. It's simply due to the gendered nature of the topic and of the research in general, so of how kind of the statistics present themselves. In general, anyone who doesn't identify as male, whether they're female, trans, non-binary, or any other identifier, they're treated differently than men in society because of what we promote as the norm. So on the same note, I may typically refer to the abusive partner as male and reference the survivor as being female. Again, that's not to say that abuse isn't happening in all different types of relationships. It's just related to the work we specifically do in the shelter and the statistics that we have available to us, but that is not to say that all abusive people are men or that the LGBTQ+ community isn't experiencing abuse. So in fact, Canadian women who identify as bisexual or lesbian are actually 3 to 4 times more likely to have reported experiencing spousal violence. So it is definitely still happening. And that stat doesn't even begin to cover the vastness of the LGBTQ+ community and their experiences with abuse and with domestic violence. But unfortunately, those stats are usually underreported or lumped into the same general categories. Again, I might refer to abuser as partner. However, abuse can and does occur outside of intimate partner relationships. So at Nova House and Serenity Place, which are our shelters under Women's Place, we support individuals fleeing abusive mothers, fathers, siblings, children, other family, and non-familial bonds too, like sometimes strangers or a landlord. That's because abuse isn't related to any specific type of relationship. It's all about power and control. So the last thing before we move on is just a little bit of a content warning. I'm not going to be discussing anything specific or vulgar or scary in specific terms. However, what we talk about today can be upsetting to some, it can be triggering to some. It's not necessarily an easy topic. So just make sure you do what you need to do to take care of yourself. So here's our little agenda for today. We'll talk about what is abuse, why does abuse happen, types of abuse and red flags, healthy relationships, and how to get and give help. Let's begin. So in Canada, every minute of every day, a woman or child is abused. In Ontario, every single year since 1975, there's been about 25 victims of spousal homicide. 25 a year. So nobody expects abuse to be occurring in their community, to their coworkers, to their friends, to their family. But the reality is 1 in 4 women will experience abuse or violence in their lifetime. It is happening in our country and it is happening in this community. The clients using our services aren't just from the outskirts of society or from low socioeconomic backgrounds either. Abuse is happening all around us, to our friends and family, to our grocery store clerk, our dentists, our neighbors, our realtors, our business owners, mothers, grandmothers, waitresses, all walks of life. Abuse does not discriminate. However, some populations do experience abuse more frequently due to their status in society and their perceived worthiness to be treated properly, which we'll discuss later. So when I say abuse, what do I mean? What I mean is this: abuse is the attempt to gain power in a relationship by trying to control how a partner thinks, acts, or feels, We'll go over some examples of how this may look and how this may present. But as I mentioned earlier, abuse is all about power and control. Those are key factors throughout. This need for power and control is really innate in our society, and it's socialized into us from birth. So much of this socialization is gendered, and it really relates to ideas about masculinity. From birth, we assign gender stereotypes to girls and boys. Girls are socialized to be kind, caring, careful, gentle, and sweet. By age 6, girls already believe that they're not as smart as boys. Boys, on the other hand, are socialized to be tough, to be manly, to make decisions, not to cry or show any fear, and to always be in control. The gender-based stereotypes that start out at birth influence us throughout our entire lives. They evolve throughout years. They impact the toys we play with, the friends we make, the interests we pursue, the classes we enjoy, the careers we aim for, and how we can interact with the world around us. Although we could talk about gender-based stereotypes at length, the takeaway is this. Society teaches men and boys, and keep that in mind, boys, that they must be powerful and have control over their lives and their emotions. This need for control and an inability to express themselves bubbles over into their relationships and perpetuates the cycle of abuse. So let's consider more about how those abuse forms come to play. When we hear the word abuse, most of us automatically might think of a physical assault or a domestic situation, which is very common. That's not wrong to think of, but it's not the only form of abuse that women experience. So in reality, someone can be in an extremely abusive situation and never be physically assaulted. Physical abuse is any intentional use of physical force with the intent to cause injury or fear. That can be the hitting, kicking, punching, slapping, and biting that we commonly think of, but it can also be throwing something at you or close to you, blocking you from leaving the room, taking your car keys, driving recklessly, and abandoning you. So while those last few things might not seem like physical abuse, they might not cause a physical injury or physical harm, but they're still involving somebody else's physical body controlling your physical body. So that means it's physical abuse. Emotional is likely the most common, and many clients really report that abuse starts with emotional and then it moves outwards and eventually closer to physical. Our clients typically report that emotional abuse is the hardest form of abuse to recover from, and that's because it's designed to be. It's any act that's intended to undermine your emotional well-being. So the action itself is designed to make you feel badly, and that's coming from your loving partner. So other examples are using your emotions against you, telling you how to think or feel, refusing to discuss important issues with you, threatening suicide, changing moods quickly, or humiliating you. Psychological abuse is really similar to emotional abuse. It's any action that causes you mental anguish or feeling like you're crazy, worthless, or to blame. Can't tell you how many clients who say that exact sentence to me. He makes me feel crazy. And that's kind of the design of the abuse. It's to make you feel uncertain about yourself and your abilities. You question your reality. Did that really happen? Are they right? Did I make that up? The abuser may change the rules in the relationship frequently. They might blame you for their unhealthy and abusive behaviors, or demand perfection and put unrealistic expectations on you, so you're doomed to fail. There's also verbal, which is the most straightforward. It's any use of language, whether that's oral language, gestured language, or written language to abuse somebody. So it could be name calling, put downs, yelling, writing mean notes, things like that. Sexual abuse is very common in a relationship. A lot of people assume because you're in a relationship or married that consent is implied, but that is not the case. You're still in control of your own body. So sexual abuse is any act that forces or pressures you to take part in an unwanted intimate activity. It could be unwanted touching, kissing, treating you like an object, refusing your access to birth control, making you feel badly about yourself, And then finally, withholding affection as well. So someone might not immediately assume that that's sexual abuse, but by using that against you, by making you feel guilty or bad and withholding affection, that is a form of sexual abuse as well. Then, of course, in this digital age, there's digital abuse. So that's using technology to intimidate, bully, harass, control, or stalk someone. And digital abuse is on the rise and has really changed the game of how abuse occurs. Previously, when someone was in an abusive relationship, if they were allowed to go to work, they might actually get a few hours of a break from that abusive person, having eyes on them, having contact with them. But now with the internet and technology, as wonderful as it is, it also gives abusers constant access to their person. So you might feel obligated to answer a text message really quick. Maybe they have passwords to your accounts. Maybe they monitor your usage of your phone. They send you negative or threatening messages, or they send you unwanted pictures or videos. The other forms include financial, so using money and resources as a means to control; property, breaking or misusing someone's property. We see this a lot after the breakdown of a relationship. So a lot of smashing cell phones, a lot of ruining clothing. Clients have had their clothing torn and ripped and bleached. Social, so any behavior that results in isolation from the outside world. By definition, most forms of abuse also form under social abuse, because if you're being abused, chances are you're being isolated from the outside world. You're not going to be very interested in going out and seeing your friends when that becomes a problem, or when the partner doesn't allow you to, or you get accused of cheating. So social abuse is very common. Spiritual religious, so that's using your spirituality to control you, or controlling how you practice your faith and what faith you practice. Pet abuse, which is awful, which is hurting or threatening to hurt a pet to gain power and control. There's cultural abuse as well, which is any use of culture to exert control or to justify abusive behaviors. So, although this list is not exhaustive, these are the most common forms of abuse. All of these forms of abuse take place within a cycle. This cycle has 3 stages. So the honeymoon phase, tension building, and explosion. Honeymoon stage is that intoxicated chemical feeling when you first meet. Everyone's familiar with the honeymoon stage. It's what we all strive for. Everyone loves that part of a relationship. Things are going hunky-dory. The tension building stage is when you start to feel like you're walking on eggshells. You start to feel easy, nervous, you're not really sure. Explosion stage, of course, is when there's a violent episode. It can be verbal, it could be physical. So those are the 3 parts of the cycle. The cycle can take place in a few different ways. You'll see on the right there, it kind of takes place within the cycle, with the honeymoon stage being really big, going into a pretty small tension buildup, and then a pretty small violent episode. You see from there, it goes to a still pretty big honeymoon phase, and then a pretty good sized tension buildup. And then the violent episode's almost doubled in size. Suddenly, it goes back to a very small honeymoon period, again, a very large buildup period, and an even larger violent episode. So some clients report that's kind of the way it goes, where the honeymoon phase gets smaller and smaller, and the violent episodes and the tension buildup become bigger, more dramatic, scarier, longer, all of those things. On the left here, we've kind of just depicted it with arrows going both ways, and that's just to acknowledge that the cycle doesn't have to happen in that perfect little cycle. What happens often as well is a relationship has its own cycle. So that might mean that you have extremely long periods of honeymoon, no tension building, and a really big explosion every once in a while. You might go straight from explosion and live in tension building for 6 months, and then go to honeymoon for a few weeks before you go back to tension building. So there's no perfect design for how it works, but ultimately what we see is that people try to access our help and services during the explosion mode, which again, of course, is fine, but it's safest if we can really get to somebody in the tension building phase and start to make with them a plan of how they can keep themselves safe when they get to the explosion, or how to prevent the explosion from happening altogether if they're able to get to a safe place, if that's what they're interested in. So understanding the cycle of abuse is key, but the main thing is the person themselves in the relationship understanding the cycle. That's something that ends up keeping people safe in the long run. So now that we know what types of abuse someone may be facing, we can talk about some signs of abuse that abuse might happen or is happening. So it could be moving too fast too soon, and especially at the start of a relationship. This can just seem really exciting. You really like each other, you're hanging out all the time, your lives become all about each other. But at the end of the day, we need different things, different hobbies. Moving too fast too soon can actually be a problem. Pushing your boundaries, so especially early on in the relationship, we hear people saying, oh, come on, when you say you don't want to do something. So it's not an immediate cause for breaking up with somebody, but just acknowledging when they're kind of pushing your boundaries and asking why. If you find yourself making excuses for them or their behavior, if you notice they're controlling, especially what you think, act, or feel. If they use drugs or alcohol as an excuse for bad behavior, and this doesn't mean if they use drugs or alcohol at all that there's a red flag or an immediate cause for concern, but if they're using their drugs or alcohol as an excuse for the way they treat you, that's a red flag. Of course, name calling and yelling. There's really no reason that any adults or children should be calling each other names, no matter how frustrated we are. If they're mean to others, so what we like to say is if they can be rude to a complete stranger, if you find they can't apologize, so that's not inability to say sorry, they might be saying sorry, but if they always follow that up with a excuse or I'm sorry, but, then they aren't truly apologizing. If they're disliked, so while you don't want to take the opinion of your friends and family above all else, if suddenly your friends are expressing some concern with who you've been seeing lately, maybe that's something to pay attention to. If they constantly talk about their exes and call them crazy, I mean, again, this can be either way, but if they're constantly talking about their exes, bringing negativity around the name and calling them names, there's really no reason for that. You can express yourself about a relationship and why it failed in a specific way. You don't need to call them crazy. So in that situation, I would say look at the common denominator. If they make you nervous, so that's not a great sign. Of course, there can be butterflies at the start of the relationship, but look at when they happen and why. If they're narcissistic, so everything becomes about them. If you notice that you're feeling afraid, if they're jealous, which again can seem really romantic at the start of a relationship, but ultimately can lead to bad things later down the line. And if you feel like you can't do anything right. So you'll notice that some of these signs are internal and some are external. So we might be able to easily see these behaviors and point to them as abuse in our friends' relationships, but we might not be able to understand how they're feeling. With that being said, we can pay really close attention to friends who are acting out of character, especially if they're acting withdrawn. And we can check in with our friends if we're seeing those changes and we think they might need a support. Sometimes supporting a friend can be difficult, and that's okay. You have the right to do what's best for you, even if that means taking a break from directly supporting someone to make sure that you're taken care of as well. But what might help is if you consider the reason someone stays in an abusive relationship. So before we move on, I'll just point out the last piece of the slide here is just listening to your gut. So it's trying to tell you something. So if you look at the signs of abuse, and you notice the things like make you nervous, feeling afraid, feeling like you can't do anything right, those are the gut feelings that you'll get, right? Okay, let's move on to why women stay. So, while some forms of abuse are easy to point to and call out, like physical abuse, we know that that's not always the case. It can be really confusing to sort of if something's abusive. Look at how many factors I just mentioned when talking about red flags. You also have to consider that the person is being abused and treated this way by somebody that they love and trust. And abusers use that love and trust as weapons to allow them to continue to abuse. So you'll notice that this slide's title is in quotes. That's because we actually need to work to shift away from asking why women stay, and instead we need to ask why abusers abuse. So we tend to ask the person being abused why this has happened. We fail to consider what that question really implies, but it really implies that it was in her control. So instead, we need to shift the language we use and focus on what barriers are in place to her leaving. We have to consider the complicated nature of the abuse and how we can support her in the way she feels she needs support. So, what keeps women from leaving? Could be no job, no support system. I'm not going to be able to read all of these because they're just going to keep piling on. They're already behind in bills. They have nowhere to go. Maybe they'll lose their job. They're a good parent. These are just some of the examples of why women aren't able to leave. Maybe the person said, if I can't have you, no one can. Maybe they love them. They'll lose medical benefits, don't want to leave their house, or worse, they think they deserve this. How is she supposed to feel any other way than I deserve this when all we ask her is, why didn't you leave sooner? Why haven't you left yet? Why did you stay? Our perception, on top of the daily blows to a self-esteem and self-worth, add to her feeling that she's at least partially to blame or responsible for her partner's abusive tendencies. She's not. She has every right to participate in a healthy relationship, but she may not even realize what that is. So an easy thing to remember about healthy relationships is that a healthy relationship is never going to require you to sacrifice your friends, your dignity, or your dreams. I have a handout sheet that I'll send in the Zoom chat at the end that has some more details about healthy relationships and just kind of like quick tips. But ultimately, a healthy relationship is everyone's goal. But there's no formal education or rule book about how to be in a healthy relationship. We just kind of have to figure it out for ourselves. But healthy relationships are where each partner is treated as an equal with equal respect. That's actually against the grain when you think about it, especially when you consider about the power imbalance that gender stereotypes has encouraged. So, we believe that 3 pillars in a healthy relationship are mutual respect, trust, and communication. Of course, there are some other factors, but those are the core features. So communication, both partners can speak freely with each other. Effective communication is really the pillar of any healthy relationship. And that's, again, something that we're not really taught. Then the next pillar is trust. So both parties feel safe with and without each other. And of course, mutual respect. So both parties support each other's activities and interests and respect their boundaries. You might notice that love was not listed as the pillar of a healthy relationship. That's because you don't need to love to be in a healthy relationship. You can think about a healthy relationship with a boss, a teacher, a coworker, your in-laws, friends. You don't need to love them. The keys are the pillars above: communication, trust, and respect. And then empathy and compassion help a lot as well. So we know that love is really powerful and can shield you from the truth. Many people stay in abusive relationships because they love that person or because they think the person loves them, and that's okay. You can absolutely love anyone you want to, but you need to also do what's in your best self-interest and do what's safe for you. You can love anyone you want, but you have to love yourself first and foremost. We can't control another person, which is why it's really important to think about the most important part of a healthy relationship: you. Healthy relationships start with you. So you have to be responsible for your own happiness and be a whole person on your own. Some people try to find someone else to make them whole or to make them happy, but that just can lead to dependency issues and unhealthy relationships. When you depend on someone else to make you happy, you're giving them power and control over your emotions, but you're in control of your own emotions. You have to beware of rose-colored glasses. So what we often wear at the start of a relationship. when we're wearing rose-colored glasses, red flags just look like flags, so it's really hard to spot them. But once that excitement wears off, we can really see some maybe potentially unhealthy traits that have controlling, jealous, or possessive undertones. So again, we can't control the actions of others. We can only control our own actions. We can be a healthy human on our own. We can set healthy boundaries, and we can participate in healthy relationships to the best of our ability. But you cannot be healthy enough to be healthy for you and someone else, no matter how hard you try. If the person hasn't done the work, you can't fix them. So it's important to put yourself first and prioritize your safety and your well-being. So if you or someone you know is in an unhealthy relationship, there are supports available. One of the main supports is an agency like Women's Place, which I'm so happy to represent today. We have a lot of different services. I'll start with safety planning. So safety planning can be tailored to your needs. It can be during a relationship, for leaving the relationship, or after. So when I mentioned earlier, we are judgment-free, I meant it. You can call the support line, which we'll talk about on the next slide, and say that you want to complete a safety plan to remain in an abusive relationship, and our support staff will just guide you through what that could look like and make sure you're as safe as possible while you're in the relationship. We offer child and youth services, which is support for kids and their moms who have been exposed to abuse. Transitional support workers that help you get housing, transition into that new housing, get it all set up again for the first time. We have counseling and office visits for in-house and external clients. We offer it from a person-centered approach. So again, we meet the client where they're at. We have a family court support worker. And of course, we have public education, which is me. So that's education on what is abuse, how to end the cycle, how to connect with Women's Place. And of course, our support line. So our support line is typically how you would get connected to services and can be the first step at living an abuse-free life. It's 24/7, it accepts collect calls, and we can also accept text messages. It's completely confidential, meaning we don't even have caller ID. We received over 3,300 calls last year and almost 2,600 in the previous year, even with long periods of lockdown. The calls can be 5 minutes or an hour. You don't need to be in crisis to call. Anyone can call us. We sometimes get calls from a friend trying to help their friend, women calling after a crisis, an individual calling because they feel like something's just not quite right in their relationship, and more. So we really want people to feel like there's no wrong reason for calling. We will always support the client to get the most appropriate information. During the call, we'll usually first check in to see if you're safe. Again, your safety is our #1 priority. Then depending on the type of call, our counselors will assess the needs, listen to the situation, offer programming and referral programs as well as external programs, and of course, complete a safety plan. If the client is seeking shelter stay, we would complete an assessment, and at that point, personal information must be provided. Again, that information is kept confidential with a few exceptions that are bound by law. So we do have a legal duty to report if somebody is intending to harm themselves or others, or if a child has been exposed to harm. We're bound by our duty to report, as is every social service agency, but we always let people know of that duty and let them make the choice as to whether or not they will give us that demographic information or not. And the support line here is the number that you would provide to someone else if you're concerned about their safety. You'll notice there's 2 numbers there. Either number is correct. One is just for Welland and surrounding areas, and one is for Niagara Falls and surrounding areas to avoid any long distance charges on your end. But again, we take collect calls, so call whichever number is easier for you. So as you can expect, our numbers were impacted a little bit by COVID. The numbers on the left side here are for pre-COVID, and then the right side are for during COVID. Unfortunately, long periods of lockdown did keep women stuck at home with abusive partners, so they were unable to access our services as easily. Okay, let's talk about how you can help someone who's experiencing abuse. So you can assure them that they're not to blame. Really listen to them and focus on their needs. Talk to them about their options, like calling Women's Place, safety planning, staying in the relationship, leaving, and then give them time to make their own decisions. Recognize it's a very hard decision to make. If you think they're in danger, you can tell them that. You can encourage them to build a really big support network by talking to their trusted friends, family, or even by joining a support group. And you can connect them with other agencies for support, like Jillian's Place, which is the equivalent of us in St. Catharines, Family and Children's Services of Niagara, if they have kids that might need support, Niagara Counseling Center, Design for a New Tomorrow, which is another counseling service, Niagara Falls Multicultural Center, or you can encourage them to speak to their family doctor. If you have no idea what agencies to connect them to support, that's okay. You can give them the support line and then we will find it for you. And the bottom disclaimer here just really says never put yourself in or others in a dangerous situation. So as much as we may encourage you to step up and step in if something is happening, don't put yourself or anyone else in immediate danger. You can call 911 in those situations. So the main thing to remember is that these individuals who are experiencing abuse have already come from a situation where they've been controlled or had decisions made for them. That's why it's better to try to provide them with options and let them choose. They might not be ready to leave the relationship, and that's their choice. So you can decide how you can support your friend while also prioritizing your mental health as well. A really good thing is just to try to build their self-esteem. That's one of the most commonly impacted parts of us when we're experiencing abuse. You helping to remind them who they are will help them guide themselves back to that person on their terms, which is great. That's all you can ask for. Other ways you can help. So even if you're not directly supporting someone experiencing abuse, you can still absolutely help end the cycle. You can check in with your friends and family if you witness something that was potentially abusive when it's safe to do so. You can model abuse-free behavior. You can confront others if they're being abusive, also if it's safe to do so. So being an advocate and not a silent bystander is something that we really encourage. There's a quote here from Martin Luther King. In the end, we will remember not the words of our enemies, but the silence of our friends. So if you see abuse happening and you don't check in with your family member when it's safe, that kind of just feeds into the cycle of abuse. These seemingly small things matter. This brings me to an end.